Tonight, we'll take you on another quiet journey through time, into one of history's more brutal chapters, told gently so your mind can rest while the past unfolds. Let me tell you about the time my life became a cautionary tale about poultry and pride. It's 1320, somewhere in the French countryside where the roads are more mud than road, and where a man's worth is measured by how many teeth he still has, and whether his roof keeps most of the rain out. Most of the rain. I'm a simple farmer. Was a simple farmer. Now I'm apparently a legend, though not the kind you'd want carved into your tombstone. My name is Henri, and I lived a perfectly unremarkable life next to the most remarkable idiot God ever saw fit to grant a title to. Lord Bertrand de Montclair. Even his name sounds pretentious, doesn't it? Bertrand owned the manor next to my modest plot of land, and he owned it the way a child owns a wooden sword, waving it around, convinced it makes him important, completely unaware of how ridiculous he looks. Now I had chickens. 7 of them. Reasonable chickens, as chickens go. They clucked, they laid eggs, they occasionally wandered about doing chicken things. Chicken things, as it turns out, do not respect the invisible lines that noble minds draw in the dirt to separate mine from yours. It was a Tuesday morning in late autumn, when my life took its turn toward the absurd. I was feeding my birds, enjoying the simple pleasure of watching creatures even less intelligent than my neighbour peck at grain, when I heard the thunderous approach of hoofbeats. Not just any hoofbeats, mind you, the kind of dramatic, purposeful hoofbeats that announce someone is about to make your day significantly worse. Lord Bertram appeared at my fence like an avenging angel, if angels wore velvet doublets and had the complexion of an overripe tomato. His horse, a magnificent beast that deserved a better rider, pranced nervously, as if it too sensed the stupidity about to unfold. "Henry!" he bellowed, and I swear 3 of my chickens stopped mid-peck to stare. Even they knew something was wrong. "Your fowl have committed an act of war." I blinked, slowly, because sometimes when life presents you with something so fundamentally ridiculous, you need a moment to make sure you heard it correctly. "My chickens?" I asked, glancing at my birds, who were now clustered near the fence, looking as confused as I felt. "What exactly have they done, my lord?" "They have crossed into my lands. They have destroyed my crops. They have—" He paused here, his face growing even redder, if such a thing were possible. "They have shown complete disrespect for the natural order." I looked at his supposed crops. What I saw was a patch of dirt that might, in very generous lighting, be considered a garden. What I did not see was anything resembling destruction, unless you counted the single turnip that appeared to have been pecked at. Once, gently. "Turnip?" I pointed. Turnip was going to feed a family. Which family? The family of mice? This, I learned, was not the response he was looking for. You see, the thing about nobles in 1320 is that they live in a world where their smallest inconvenience becomes everyone else's greatest crisis. A torn stocking is a tragedy. A delayed meal is grounds for war, and apparently a chicken showing interest in a dying turnip is an act of international aggression. "Your birds," he continued, now gesturing dramatically enough to spook his horse, "have violated the sacred boundaries of my estate. They have trespassed. They have pillaged. They have—" "You might have what now?" "Pillades." I glanced at my chickens again. Bernadette, my largest hen, was currently engaged in the dangerous act of preening her feathers. Claude, my rooster, was standing on one leg in what I could only assume was either deep meditation or a nap. The others were scattered about, pecking at things that may or may not have been food, as chickens do. "Lord Bertrand," I said carefully, because I could see this conversation was teetering on the edge of something much larger and much more stupid than either of us was prepared for. "Perhaps we could discuss compensation for your turnip." "Compensation?" His voice cracked like a boy whose voice was changing, except Lord Bertram was well past 30 and should have known better. "This is not about compensation, Henri. This is about principle." "Ah, yes, principle. The thing that makes reasonable people do unreasonable things, usually involving either money or bloodshed, sometimes both. What principle would that be, my lord? The principle that a man's land is sacred, that boundaries matter, that... He was sputtering now, which was unfortunate because Spittle was not improving his already questionable appearance. That chickens cannot simply wander wherever they please as if they own the world. And there it was. The moment I realized that my quiet, unremarkable life was about to become anything but. Because in that moment, looking at this red-faced nobleman, having what could only be described as a tantrum over poultry, I made a terrible mistake. I laughed. Not a polite chuckle, not a nervous giggle, a full, honest, from-the-belly laugh at the pure, crystalline absurdity of a grown man declaring war on chickens. His face went from red to purple, his horse took a step back. Even the chickens seemed to sense that something had fundamentally shifted in the fabric of reality. You dare mock me?" "My lord," I said, still chuckling, because sometimes the truth is so ridiculous that laughter is the only sane response. "I'm not mocking you, I'm mocking the situation, because this situation is very, very mockable." "Wrong answer. This," he declared, pointing at me with the kind of dramatic flourish usually reserved for challenging dragons, "is not over." And with that he wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving me standing in my yard with 7 confused chickens and the growing suspicion that my life was about to become much more interesting than I had ever wanted. You know what the truly maddening part was? The chickens hadn't even been briefed on the borders. No one had explained to them that this patch of dirt was different from that patch of dirt. They were just being chickens, doing chicken things, in a world that suddenly decided that chicken things were a matter of life and death. As I watched Lord Bertrand disappear in a cloud of dramatically kicked-up dust, I had no idea that this was just the beginning. That a single pecked turnip was about to launch what would later be sung about in taverns as the Great Chicken War. Though I suppose I should have known. In my experience, the stupidest conflicts always start with the smallest things, and few things are smaller, or apparently more dangerous, than a chicken with poor understanding of property law. Three days passed. 3 blissfully quiet days where I almost convinced myself that Lord Bertrand had come to his senses, realized the magnificent absurdity of his position, and decided to let sleeping chickens lie. I should have known better. On the 4th day, as I was enjoying my morning porridge and watching my chickens engage in their daily ritual of looking confused about everything, I heard a commotion at my gate. Not the thunderous hoofbeats of an angry nobleman this time, but something worse. The official footsteps of bureaucracy. A page boy appeared. Couldn't have been more than 14, thin as a reed, wearing livery that was too big for him, and an expression that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else, doing anything else. He carried in his hand something that made my heart sink. A scroll. Not just any scroll. This was a proper scroll, with ribbons and seals and all the other theatrical nonsense that people with too much time and too little sense use to make their ridiculous demands seem important. "Henry of?" The boy squinted at the scroll. "Of the chicken place?" "That's not actually my surname, lad. The Lord Bertrand de Montclair demands I deliver this to Henri of the chicken place." I sighed and accepted the scroll. It was heavier than it had any right to be, weighted down with what I could only assume was the accumulated dignity of wounded nobility. "There's supposed to be a response," the page boy added, looking about as thrilled with this prospect as I felt. I broke the seal. Red wax, naturally, because nothing says I'm taking this very seriously like red wax, and unrolled what turned out to be the most magnificently ridiculous document I had ever seen. It was written in Latin, because of course it was, because when you're going to be absurd, why not be absurd in a dead language? Fortunately, I'd had some education from the local priest, enough to stumble through the flowery legal language that Lord Bertrand had apparently paid someone to translate his chicken rage into. What I read was a masterpiece of bureaucratic fury. "To Henri, keeper of unlawful fowl, violator of sacred boundaries, enemy of order." It went on like that for several paragraphs. Apparently I was also a disturber of peace, a threat to civilization, and, my personal favourite, one who corrupts the natural harmony through negligent poultry management. But the real meat of the document, if you'll pardon the expression, came in the middle. Lord Bertrand was demanding compensation, not just for his precious turnip, mind you, but for what he termed emotional distress caused by flagrant disrespect. Yes, the chickens had hurt his feelings. The list of demands was comprehensive. Financial compensation for the turnip, additional compensation for the trauma of witnessing said destruction, payment for the restoration of damaged dignity, and, this is where I started laughing again, which was becoming a dangerous habit, compensation for the disruption of mental tranquility. His mental tranquility had been disrupted. By chickens. But wait, there was more. At the bottom of the scroll, in letters that seemed to grow larger as they became more indignant, Lord Bertrand had outlined his final terms. Immediate payment of 12 silver coins, roughly 6 months of my income. Public apology for my disrespectful laughter. Construction of a fence to contain my agents of chaos. Weekly tribute of eggs as acknowledgement of wrongdoing. A written promise that my chickens would conduct themselves with appropriate deference. I read that last point 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. He wanted me to negotiate a peace treaty with my chickens. The page boy was shifting from foot to foot, clearly hoping this would all be over soon so he could return to whatever page boys do when they're not delivering declarations of poultry war. "Tell me," I said to him, "do you think this is reasonable?" He glanced around nervously, as if Lord Bertrand might be hiding behind a bush. "I'm not paid to think, sir. I'm paid to deliver messages and look official." "And do you look official?" He considered this seriously. "I look like a scarecrow wearing my older brother's clothes, sir." I liked this boy. "Well then," I said, "tell Lord Bertrand that I will consider his demands and respond accordingly." What I was actually considering was whether there was any point in trying to reason with a man who had managed to escalate a poultry dispute into what was essentially a formal declaration of war. The answer, as I suspected, was no. But I decided to try anyway, because sometimes the right thing to do is also the stupid thing to do, and I was apparently committed to this path of stupidity. I spent the evening composing my response. Not in Latin, I wasn't going to dignify this nonsense with dead languages, but in simple, clear French that even a nobleman could understand. "Dear Lord Bertrand," I wrote, "I have received your list of demands regarding the great turnip incident of Tuesday last. In response, I would like to offer the following compromise. 1 basket of eggs delivered monthly in exchange for your agreement that chickens, being chickens, cannot be held to the same standards of property law as rational creatures." I thought this was reasonable. I was wrong. The next morning, the same page boy returned. This time, he wasn't carrying a scroll. He was carrying a small leather glove. "Lord Bertram says to give you this," the boy said, looking even more uncomfortable than before. I stared at the glove. It was a nice glove. Well made. The kind of thing a nobleman might wear when he wanted to look important while doing nothing useful. "He says I'm supposed to," the boy swallowed hard, "slap you with it." "Slap me with it?" "Yes, sir." He was very specific about the slapping. I looked at this thin boy, holding a glove that was probably worth more than his family saw in a year, tasked with delivering what was essentially a formal insult on behalf of a man who was apparently having some sort of elaborate breakdown over farm animals. "Go ahead then," I said. He slapped me with the glove, gently, almost apologetically. "There," he said, "I've slapped you. He says that means you've been challenged." "Challenged to what?" He didn't say, sir. He just said the slapping was very important. And that's how I learned that Lord Bertrand de Montclair had officially challenged me to something over chickens, with formal glove slapping. As I watched the page boy hurry away, probably eager to find employment with someone slightly less insane, I realized that this situation had moved beyond simple neighbourly dispute. This was now a matter of honour, apparently, medieval honour, which was like regular honour except stupider and with more opportunities for someone to get hurt. I looked at my chickens, who were going about their daily business with the blissful ignorance of creatures who had somehow become the centre of a diplomatic crisis without anyone bothering to inform them. "Well, girls," I said to them, I hope you're proud of yourselves. You've started a war." Bernadette clucked once, which I chose to interpret as either an apology or a declaration that she regretted nothing. Given what was coming next, I'm pretty sure it was the latter. You know what they say about good intentions paving the road to somewhere unpleasant? Well, someone clearly forgot to mention this to Father Marcel, our local priest, who took it upon himself to mediate what was rapidly becoming known throughout the village as the chicken situation. Father Marcel was a good man, simple, earnest, possessed of the kind of optimism that comes from spending most of your time talking to God instead of people. He believed, with the touching faith of someone who had never dealt with nobility having a public breakdown, that all conflicts could be resolved through prayer, understanding, and perhaps a nice meal shared between reasonable adults. He had clearly never met Lord Bertrand. Father Marcel appeared at my door on the morning after the glove-slapping incident, carrying his Bible, a bottle of what looked like communion wine, and the serene expression of a man who was about to discover just how unreasonable reasonable people could be. "Henry, my son," he said, settling himself on the rough bench outside my cottage, "I understand there's been some difficulty with your neighbour." "You could say that, Father." "Perhaps," he suggested with the gentle tone of someone who solved most problems by suggesting people be nicer to each other, "we could discuss this, like Christian men, share a meal, talk through the misunderstanding." I looked at him. This kind, well-meaning man who thought that the current crisis was a misunderstanding rather than the spectacular collision of wounded pride and paltry property disputes, and I felt genuinely sorry for what was about to happen to his worldview. "Father," I said carefully, "Lord Bertrand has formally challenged me to combat over the fact that my chickens ate his turnip." Father Marcel blinked. "Surely you mean he's challenged you to discussion? Negotiation?" "No, Father. Combat. With the glove slapping and everything." "The glove? But that's—" Father Marcel's optimism flickered like a candle in a strong wind. "That's medieval." "We are medieval, Father." "Yes, but we're civilized medieval." This was the moment I realized that Father Marcel, despite his education and calling, had somehow managed to avoid learning what people were actually like when their dignity was threatened. It was almost endearing. "Perhaps," he said, rallying his faith in human reasonableness, "if I spoke to Lord Bertrand, surely a man of his standing would listen to reason from a man of God." I tried to warn him, I really did. But Father Marcel had that light in his eyes that good people get when they're convinced they can fix things that are fundamentally unfixable. And sometimes you have to let good people learn hard lessons, even when you know it's going to hurt. So off he went, Bible under his arm, wine bottle in hand, ready to bring peace and understanding to a conflict that had already moved well beyond the reach of either. He returned 3 hours later, looking like a man who had stared into the abyss and discovered that the abyss was wearing velvet and shouting about chickens. "Well?" I asked. Father Marcel sat down heavily on my bench, uncorked his wine bottle, and took a long drink that would have scandalized his congregation if they'd seen it. Father Marcel paused, clearly struggling to find words that wouldn't violate his vows about charitable thinking. "He is a very passionate man." "What happened?" I suggested reconciliation. Perhaps a blessing for both your households. Maybe a shared fence, built together as a symbol of neighbourly cooperation. He accused me of taking sides, said I was clearly in league with your, how did he put it, forces of avian destruction. I winced. "He said that about you?" "He said," Father Marcel continued, his voice growing increasingly strained, "that any priest who would defend the rights of chickens to wander freely was obviously corrupted by liberal theology." Liberal theology? Apparently believing that chickens shouldn't be tried for treason makes me a dangerous radical. Father Marcel took another drink of wine, a longer one this time. "But surely," I said when you explained that this was all about a single turnip. "Ah!" Father Marcel's expression grew pained. "That's when things got worse." "Worse how?" "He'll showed me the turnip. He kept the turnip. He's preserved the turnip. In a place of honour. On his mantelpiece. He's been showing it to visitors as evidence of the unprovoked assault on his property." I stared at Father Marcel, waiting for the punchline that never came. He's turned it into a shrine, Father Marcel continued, his voice barely above a whisper. There are candles around it, and a small plaque that reads, "Lest we forget." We sat in silence for a moment, contemplating a world where a grown man had created a memorial to a root vegetable. "There's more," Father Marcel said finally. "What?" "He's banned me from his lands, said that any priest who would defend chicken terrorism was no longer welcome on his estate. He's also," Father Marcel took another drink, "he's declared your chickens enemies of the realm." "Enemies of what realm? He's not a king." I pointed that out. That's when he started talking about writing to the bishop, and possibly the king, about the growing threat of radical chickens undermining the social order. I looked over at my chickens, who were currently engaged in their daily battle with gravity, pecking at things that weren't there, and generally existing in a state of blissful ignorance about their new status as enemies of the realm. "Father," I said, "I think we need to accept that Lord Bertrand has moved beyond the reach of reason." "But surely," Father Marcel's optimism made one last valiant attempt, "surely no one would actually fight a duel over chickens." "Father, he's turned a turnip into a religious artifact." "Good point." That evening I sat down with quill and parchment, not to write another diplomatic letter, but to record what was happening. Because I was starting to realize that this situation had moved beyond simple neighbourly dispute and into the realm of cautionary tale. Future generations needed to know how quickly things could spiral when pride and poultry collided. I wrote, "Let it be known that in the year of our Lord 1320, a conflict arose between neighbours over matters poultry. What began as a simple case of chickens being chickens has escalated into a formal declaration of war against the birds themselves. The local priest has been banished for the crime of suggesting that peace might be preferable to bloodshed. A turnip has been martyred, and somewhere in all of this the chickens continue to do what chickens do, exist in a state of cheerful oblivion to the chaos they have unleashed." As I wrote, I could hear Lord Bertram's voice carrying across the evening air from his manor, apparently explaining to someone, possibly his horse, the grave threat posed by domestic fowl to the foundations of civilization. The chickens, for their part, had retired for the evening without once asking to be briefed on their new status as enemies of the state. I was beginning to understand that some conflicts can't be resolved through reason, compromise, or even divine interference. Some conflicts can only be resolved through one side proving to be so spectacularly unreasonable that reality itself intervenes. Unfortunately, I was starting to suspect that Lord Bertram was prepared to be unreasonable for a very, very long time. And the chickens, bless them, were showing no signs of developing either legal awareness or diplomatic skills. This was going to get worse before it got better. Much worse. I should have seen it coming. When a man creates a shrine to a turnip and declares war on chickens, traditional conflict resolution becomes somewhat inadequate. But I was still surprised when Lord Bertrand's formal challenge arrived, delivered once again by the increasingly traumatized page boy, who was starting to look like he was considering a career change. This time the scroll was even more elaborate: red ribbon, gold seal, and what appeared to be actual calligraphy. Someone had been paid good money to make official documents about poultry disputes. "Henri of the chicken place," the page boy announced with the weary tone of someone who had given up on life making sense. "You are hereby challenged to trial by combat to settle the matter of the unlawful fowl and their crimes against nature." Trial by combat? Yes, sir. Formal duel, weapons, witnesses, the whole affair. I unrolled the scroll, which turned out to be a masterpiece of medieval legal theatre. Lord Bertrand had apparently consulted with someone who knew the proper forms for these things, because the document was full of whereases and heretofores, and other words that people use when they want to make their insanity sound official. The key points, stripped of their legal decorations, were these. I was formally accused of crimes against property and dignity, having failed to provide adequate satisfaction for these crimes. I was challenged to trial by combat to let God judge the righteousness of our causes. The duel would take place at dawn 1 week hence. Weapons would be swords. The entire village was invited to witness justice being served. He's really doing this. I said, more to myself than to the page boy. "Oh yes, sir. He's been practicing. With a straw dummy. He named it Henry the Chicken Lover. He named his practice dummy after me. Yes, sir. He's been stabbing it quite enthusiastically while shouting things about honour and turnips." I looked at the challenge again, hoping I'd misread something. But no, there it was in elaborate script. Lord Bertrand de Montclair was challenging me to mortal combat over the fact that my chickens had once shown interest in his vegetables. "What am I supposed to do with this?" I asked. "Well, sir, you can accept the challenge, in which case you show up with a sword and try not to die, or you can refuse, in which case you're officially a coward and he gets to claim victory by default. Those are my options?" "Those are your options, sir." I thought about this. On one hand, fighting a duel over chickens was possibly the stupidest thing anyone had ever suggested in the entire history of stupid suggestions. On the other hand, refusing would mean letting Lord Bertrand claim that he had been right all along, that his turnip shrine was justified, and that my chickens were indeed enemies of civilization. Also, and I'm not proud of this, but by this point I was genuinely curious to see just how far this madness could go. "Tell Lord Bertrand," I said, "that I accept his challenge." The page boy looked surprised. "Really, sir?" "Really. You're going to fight him, with swords, over chickens?" "Apparently I am." "Sir," the page boy said with the earnest concern of someone who had seen too much absurdity in his young life, "he's been practicing, quite a lot. The dummy is very dead." "I appreciate the warning." "Also, sir, he's been telling everyone in the village about the duel. There are people coming from 3 towns over to watch. Someone's organising betting pools." This gave me pause. "Betting pools?" "Yes, sir. The odds are not in your favour." "What are the odds?" 10 to 1 against you, sir, mostly because everyone thinks anyone willing to fight a duel over chickens is probably insane, and insane people are unpredictable in fights. There was a certain logic to this that I couldn't argue with. "There's also," the page boy added, "going to be food and entertainment. Someone hired a musician. It's become quite the event. So my potential death had become a social gathering. This somehow made the whole thing even more absurd, which I hadn't thought possible." "Very well," I said. "Tell Lord Bertrand that Henri of the chicken place accepts his challenge and will meet him at dawn, 1 week hence, to settle this matter with steel." "Should I tell him anything else, sir?" "Tell him," I said, surprising myself with a sudden surge of determination, "that the chickens will be watching." The page boy grinned. It was the first genuine smile I'd seen from him. "That should annoy him considerably, sir." "That's the idea." That evening, as word spread through the village about the upcoming duel, I found myself with a steady stream of visitors. Some came to offer advice, most of it involving running away in the middle of the night. Some came to wish me luck, and some, I suspect, came to get a good look at the man who was about to die in possibly the most ridiculous duel in recorded history. Old Thomas, who had lived through more fights than anyone in the village, brought me a battered sword that had apparently belonged to his grandfather. "It's not much to look at," he said, "but it's got good balance, and it's already killed a few fools." "Thank you, Thomas." "You know," he said, settling onto my bench with the careful movements of a man whose joints had been complaining for decades, "in my day we fought duels over important things. Women, honour, disputed inheritances. And now we fight over chickens." He shook his head. "The world's getting strange, Henri." "The world's always been strange, Thomas. We're just getting better at noticing." The village baker brought bread. The blacksmith offered to sharpen Thomas's sword. The tavern keeper brought ale, and cheerfully informed me that he was taking bets on whether I'd last more than 30 seconds. "Nothing personal," he said. "It's just good business." Even Father Marcel appeared, though he looked like a man wrestling with his conscience. "I cannot condone violence," he said carefully. "But I also cannot condone letting a madman claim victory through intimidation." "What are you saying, Father?" "I'm saying," he replied with the air of a man choosing his words very carefully, "that sometimes even God appreciates when someone stands up to bullies, even when the bullying is about poultry." "You think God cares about chicken disputes?" Father Marcel considered this seriously. "I think God cares about justice. and there's something deeply unjust about a man who would rather fight than admit he overreacted to a pecked turnip. As the evening wore on and my visitors drifted away, I found myself alone with my thoughts and my chickens. The birds, blissfully unaware that they had become the cause of what was shaping up to be the social event of the season, went about their evening routine of looking confused and making soft clucking sounds. "Well, girls," I said to them, "I hope you're satisfied. Your little turnip adventure has led to this." Bernadette cocked her head at me in what I chose to interpret as either sympathy or amusement. "A week from now," I continued, "I'm going to stand in a field with a sword facing a man who has completely lost his mind, fighting for your honour. For the record, this is not how I plan to die." Claude, my rooster, crowed once. Whether this was encouragement or commentary, I couldn't tell. But as I sat there, in the gathering dusk, watching my unwitting agents of chaos settle in for the night, I realised something. I was no longer just the victim of circumstances. I was no longer just the reasonable man trying to deal with an unreasonable situation. I was leaning into it, embracing the madness. If Lord Bertrand wanted to turn this into theatre, then by God, I was going to give him a performance worth remembering. After all, someone had to stand up for the chickens. Someone had to prove that you couldn't just declare war on farm animals and expect the world to take you seriously. And if that someone happened to be me, armed with a borrowed sword and a complete lack of formal combat training, well, at least it would make for an interesting story. Assuming anyone survived to tell it. Dawn came too early, and not early enough, if that makes sense. I'd spent most of the night alternating between practicing sword swings in my yard, much to the alarm of my chickens, and wondering if there was still time to fake my own death and flee to another kingdom. There wasn't. By the time the first light crept over the horizon, half the countryside had assembled in the field that Lord Bertrand had designated as our arena. And when I say arena, I mean the muddy patch of ground behind the blacksmith's shop that usually served as a place for people to relieve themselves when the tavern got too crowded. It was not, in other words, a setting that inspired thoughts of noble combat and glorious victory. The crowd was festive. Someone had indeed hired a musician who was playing what I could only assume were traditional duelling songs, though they sounded suspiciously like drinking songs. The baker had set up a stall selling meat pies. Children were running around, treating the whole thing like a harvest festival. And there, in the centre of it all, stood Lord Bertrand de Montclair. He had dressed for the occasion. Full armour, well, mostly full armour. Some pieces seemed to be missing, probably because wearing a complete suit of metal at dawn in autumn was apparently less comfortable than looking impressive. He carried a sword that was clearly meant for display rather than actual use, all elaborate crossguard and decorative pommel. He also wore a banner across his chest that read, in careful lettering, "Defender of Turnips." I stared at this for a long moment, trying to process the fact that a grown man had not only made himself a banner about root vegetables, but was wearing it proudly in public. "Quite the spectacle," said a voice behind me. I turned to find Father Marcel, who had apparently decided that his pastoral duties included witnessing what might be the death of one of his parishioners over poultry property disputes. "You made a banner, Father." "I see that. About turnips." "Yes. This is really happening, isn't it?" Father Marcel sighed. "I'm afraid so, my son. Though I must say, I've never seen the village so enthusiastic about anything." He was right. The crowd was growing by the minute, and the general mood was that of people who had stumbled upon entertainment that was both free and completely unprecedented. Someone had started selling ribbons in different colours, blue for me, red for Lord Bertrand, and people were wearing them like this was some sort of sporting event. Which, I realised, it essentially was, except that one of us might actually die, and it would all be over chickens. "Henri," Lord Bertram's voice boomed across the field. "Are you prepared to face justice?" The crowd quieted, sensing that the main event was about to begin. I walked to the centre of the field, carrying Thomas's borrowed sword and wearing my best tunic, the one I usually save for church, because if I was going to die in combat, I wanted to look respectable doing it. "I'm prepared to end this foolishness," I called back, which got a cheer from the portion of the crowd wearing blue ribbons. Foolishness? Lord Bertram's voice cracked with indignation. You call the defence of property and honour foolishness? I call declaring war on chickens foolishness. This got an even bigger cheer, and I realised that somewhere in the past week I had stopped being the reasonable neighbour trying to avoid conflict and had become the local champion of common sense in the face of spectacular overreaction. Silence, Lord Bertram bellowed, raising his ornate sword above his head. Let God judge between us. The crowd settled into an expectant hush. The musicians stopped playing. Even the children stopped running around, sensing that something significant was about to happen, even if none of us were entirely sure what. Father Marcel stepped forward, apparently having appointed himself the official whatever it is priests become when they oversee armed combat over agricultural disputes. Henri, he began, clearly struggling with the ceremonial aspects of this situation. And Lord Bertrand de Montclair, you have chosen to settle your differences through trial by combat. May God protect the righteous, and may this all be over quickly. Not exactly inspiring words, but they seem to satisfy the requirements of formal dueling protocol. Are both parties ready? Father Marcel asked. Ready to defend the sacred rights of property owners everywhere, Lord Bertram declared, striking what he probably thought was a heroic pose, but mostly looked like someone trying not to fall over in armour that didn't quite fit. Ready to get this over with, I replied, which was honest if not particularly dramatic. Then, begin? Father Marcel stepped back quickly, apparently having exhausted his knowledge of duelling etiquette. Lord Bertram charged. Now I should mention that while I had never fought a formal duel, I had spent my entire life doing physical labour, hauling water, chopping wood, wrestling with livestock, all activities that build practical strength and reflexes. Lord Bertrand, on the other hand, had spent his life having other people do things for him, while he practiced looking important. This difference became apparent immediately. His charge was impressive-looking but fundamentally uncoordinated, like watching someone try to run while wearing a cooking pot on their head and carrying too many groceries. I stepped aside, not with any particular skill, just the basic human instinct to avoid being stabbed, and he thundered past me, sword waving wildly in the air. The crowd made an appreciative ooh sound. Lord Bertrand wheeled around, his face now red with exertion and what I suspected was growing embarrassment. Stand still and fight like a man. I am fighting like a man, I called back. A man who doesn't want to be stabbed. This got another cheer from my supporters, which seemed to enrage Lord Bertrand further. He came at me again, this time with a series of wild swings that looked like he was trying to chop down a particularly stubborn tree. I backed away, parrying when I had to, mostly just trying to stay out of range of his increasingly frantic attacks. It occurred to me that this was less like formal combat and more like watching someone have an elaborate tantrum with sharp objects. Fight me properly, he gasped, pausing to catch his breath. How would you like me to fight you? I asked. With honour? Dignity? Or would you prefer I just stand here and let you stab me? He was getting confused now, which was making his sword work even worse, if such a thing were possible. That's when I realised something important. I was actually enjoying this. Not the potential death part, obviously, but the sheer theatrical absurdity of it all. Here was a man who had worked himself into such a state over a pecked turnip that he was now engaging in formal combat while wearing a banner about root vegetables, and somehow I had become the voice of reason in this scenario. It was liberating in a way. I had spent my entire life being reasonable, diplomatic, trying to avoid conflict, but sometimes apparently the only reasonable response to complete unreasonableness is to meet it head-on and see who blinks first. You know what, Lord Bertrand? I called out, raising my sword. You want to fight? Let's have a fight. And with that, I named my sword. Out loud, in front of everyone. Come meet Cluck, I announced, brandishing Thomas's old blade. The crowd erupted in laughter and cheers. Even some of the people wearing red ribbons seemed to appreciate the joke. Lord Bertrand, however, did not appreciate the joke. Slew, he shrieked, his voice climbing to heights that would have impressed the village choir. You named your sword after a chicken? I named my sword after the sound chickens make, I corrected, because apparently that sound is terrifying enough to drive grown men to armed combat. This was too much for Lord Bertrand's dignity to bear. With a wordless roar of rage, he launched himself at me with complete abandon, no longer even pretending to use proper swordwork, just swinging wildly in all directions, like a man trying to beat a swarm of bees to death. I parried, dodged, and found myself actually fighting back now, not with any great skill, but with the grim determination of a man who had suddenly realized that he was committed to this path of madness, and might as well see it through properly. We clashed in the centre of the field, our swords ringing against each other while the crowd cheered and the musicians started playing again. Something dramatic and completely inappropriate for what was essentially an argument about poultry that had gotten severely out of hand. Lord Bertram was stronger than I'd expected, but he was also getting tired much faster, weighed down by his armour and his complete inability to pace himself. I, on the other hand, was discovering that I was apparently good at this fighting business, possibly because I approached it the same way I approached most problems, with patience, common sense, and a willingness to let my opponent defeat himself. "Stand still," he panted, taking another wild swing that missed me by a foot. "Why would I do that?" I asked, stepping back and letting him overbalance himself. "That seems tactically unsound." "Because," he swung again, "it's the another miss honourable thing to do." "Honour?" I laughed, and realised I was actually having fun now. "You want to talk about honour? You declared war on chickens. You made a shrine to a turnip. You're wearing a banner about vegetables." Each point I made seemed to make him angrier, which made his attacks wilder, which made them easier to avoid. It was like watching a man try to fight his own shadow while slowly drowning in his own indignation. And then, inevitably, physics intervened. Lord Bertrand, in his fury to land a blow on someone who kept pointing out how ridiculous he was being, put all his weight behind one final massive swing that was intended to end the fight once and for all. He missed. Not by a little, by a lot. The momentum of his swing, combined with the weight of his armour and his complete exhaustion, sent him spinning like a child's top. He took 3 staggering steps, his sword flew out of his hands, and he crashed face first into the mud with a sound like a sack of grain being dropped from a great height. The field went completely silent. I stood there, sword still in hand, looking down at Lord Bertrand de Montclair, defender of turnips, as he lay motionless in the mud that had been churned up by our dramatic combat. For a moment, I worried that I had actually killed him, which would have made this the stupidest accidental death in the history of stupid accidental deaths. Then he moved. Slowly. Painfully. He rolled over, revealing a face that was now more mud than aristocrat, and looked up at me with the expression of a man who was just beginning to understand how far he had fallen. He began, then stopped, apparently realizing that there was nothing he could say that would restore any dignity to this situation. The crowd waited. Father Marcel waited. Even the chickens, who had somehow wandered over to watch their own trial by combat, waited. "Do you yield?" I asked, because that seemed like the sort of thing you were supposed to ask in these situations. Lord Bertrand looked at me, then at the crowd, then at his muddy armour and his banner, which now read Fender of Nips, due to strategic mud placement. "Aye," he said again, and then, in a voice so quiet I had to lean down to hear it, "The chickens, they really just wanted the turnip, didn't they?" "Yes," I said gently. "They really just wanted the turnip." He lay there for another moment, contemplating this revelation. "I may have overreacted," he admitted. The crowd, sensing that the entertainment was winding down, began to cheer. Not for victory or defeat, but for the simple human moment of a man realizing that he had been magnificently, spectacularly wrong about everything. Father Marcel approached cautiously. "Is the conflict resolved?" I looked down at Lord Bertrand, who was now trying to sit up and mostly failing due to the combination of mud, armour, and what I suspected was a profound reassessment of his life choices. "I think so," I said, "though we should probably help him up." And that's how the Great Chicken War of 1320 ended, not with death or glory, but with 2 grown men helping a third man out of the mud, while a crowd of villagers applauded, and chickens wandered around looking confused about why everyone was making such a fuss. It wasn't exactly the stuff of legends, or so I thought. You would think that would be the end of it. Two neighbours, having exhausted the possibilities of escalation over a poultry dispute, would simply return to their lives with perhaps a bit more wisdom and a lot more humility. You would be wrong. What actually happened was that someone, I suspect it was the musician, who had clearly been paying attention, turned the entire affair into a song. And not just any song, but the kind of song that gets stuck in people's heads and spreads from village to village like a particularly catchy plague. The first time I heard it, I was in the tavern 3 days after the duel, trying to enjoy a quiet drink and pretend that my life had returned to normal. The musician stood up, cleared his throat, and began. "Come gather round, I'll tell the tale of Henri and his chicken's trail. Across the lands of Montclair's pride, where turnips lived and turnips died." The entire tavern joined in on the chorus. On the chicken war of 21, was fought with steel but hurt with fun, when noble pride met paltry might, and both sides learned to do what's right. I wanted to sink through the floor. Not because the song was bad, it was actually quite good, with a melody that was annoyingly memorable, but because somehow, in the space of 1 week, I had gone from being a simple farmer to being the protagonist of a folk song. "They're calling you Henri the Chicken Knight," said Thomas, sliding onto the bench beside me and grinning like a man who was thoroughly enjoying my discomfort. "You're calling me what now?" "The farmer who fought for eggs," added the baker, who was clearly having the time of his life. "The defender of poultry rights. Oh, and my personal favourite, the man who made a lord eat mud." "I didn't make him eat mud. He fell into the mud." "That's not how the song tells it," Thomas pointed out. "In the song, you're a master swordsman who deliberately disarmed him and then gave a speech about the rights of farm animals." "I did not give a speech." "Let all who would oppress the feathered folk beware," the baker quoted with obvious relish, "for justice comes on wings of righteousness." "Like her efforts at your expense." "You're saying it in the song," Thomas said reasonably, "and the song is much more dramatic than what actually happened." This, I was learning, was how legends worked. Reality was just the starting point. Truth was negotiable, and apparently my life was now public domain. But the most surprising development came later that week, when Lord Bertrand himself appeared at my door. Not on horseback this time, not in armour, just a man in simple clothes, looking like someone who had spent several days thinking very hard about his recent choices. "Henri," he said, and his voice was different now, quieter, less certain. Might I have a word?" I invited him in, mostly because I was curious to see what version of Lord Bertrand would emerge from the wreckage of his dignity. What I found was a man who had clearly been having some sort of personal reckoning. He sat at my simple table, in my simple cottage, looking around at my simple life, with what appeared to be genuine interest, rather than the barely concealed disdain I was used to seeing from nobility. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. "For the duel?" "For all of it. The turnip, the letters, the shrine." He winced. "God's blood, Henri, I made a shrine to a turnip. What was I thinking?" "I've been wondering that myself." He laughed, and it was a different laugh than I'd ever heard from him, self-deprecating rather than self-permittent. "Do you know what the worst part is? I don't even like turnips, never have, but it was my turnip on my land, and when your chicken showed interest in it, I felt diminished somehow. Diminished by chickens, diminished by the idea that anything, even chickens, could treat my property as if it belonged to them rather than to me." He shook his head. "It sounds insane when I say it out loud." "It sounded insane when you were living it." "Yes, well..." He looked embarrassed. "I've never been very good at admitting when I'm wrong. Comes with the territory, I suppose. When you're raised to believe that your birth makes you better than other people, it becomes very difficult to accept that you might sometimes be worse." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Two men who had recently tried to kill each other over poultry, now sharing the kind of honest conversation that usually only happens after someone has made a complete fool of themselves in public. The song, he said eventually. "Have you heard it?" "Unfortunately. I'm the villain, the mad lord who declares war on chickens. They're singing it in my own village, Henri. My own servants are humming it while they work." "I'm sorry about that." "Don't be. It's accurate. I did declare war on chickens. I did make a shrine to a turnip. If future generations are going to remember me for anything, it might as well be for being magnificently, spectacularly wrong about something. There are worse legacies." "True. At least I'll be remembered as entertaining rather than merely incompetent." He stood to leave, then paused at the door. "Henri, your chickens. They're welcome to visit my turnips any time, assuming I grow any more turnips, which seems unlikely given recent events. I'll let them know." "Good. And Henri, thank you." "To what?" "For showing me what I looked like. Sometimes it takes someone willing to fight you, to make you realize you've been fighting the wrong battle all along." After he left, I went out to check on my chickens, who were going about their daily business with the same cheerful obliviousness they'd shown throughout this entire affair. They had no idea that they were now famous. They didn't know that songs were being sung about their great victory over the forces of aristocratic overreaction. They were just being chickens. "Well, girls," I said to them, "you've made history. Future generations will sing songs about the time you ate a turnip and accidentally started a war." Bernadette clucked once, which I chose to interpret as pride in their achievement. Just try not to let it go to your heads. As I watched them peck and scratch and generally exist in their state of perpetual confusion about the world around them, I realized something important. Sometimes the best way to deal with life's absurdities is to meet them head on, not with anger or indignation, but with the simple recognition that absurdity is part of the human condition. Lord Bertrand had gotten caught up in his own importance and forgotten that sometimes a turnip is just a turnip. I had nearly made the same mistake by taking his response too seriously. The chickens, in their infinite wisdom, had never forgotten that their only job was to be chickens. Maybe that's what the song was really about, not the glory of combat or the triumph of justice, but the simple truth that when you strip away all the posturing and drama and wounded pride, most conflicts come down to someone forgetting what actually matters. In Lord Bertram's case, what mattered was being a decent neighbour. In my case, what mattered was standing up for what was right without losing sight of what was reasonable. And in the chickens' case, what mattered was finding something to eat. The chickens, as usual, had figured it out first. These days, when I can't sleep, I think about that morning in the muddy field behind the blacksmith's shop. I think about the crowd cheering, the musician playing, and the sight of a grown man in armour lying face down in the mud because he couldn't admit that sometimes chickens just do what chickens do. I think about how quickly things can spiral when pride gets involved, and how difficult it can be to step back from a conflict once you've invested your dignity in being right about it. But mostly, I think about how lucky I was to be part of something so magnificently, completely ridiculous that people are still singing about it years later. After all, how many people can say they fought in a war over chickens and live to tell the tale? Not many, I'd wager. And that's probably for the best. The world has enough conflicts over important things. Sometimes it's refreshing to remember that even the smallest, most absurd disputes can teach us something about ourselves, usually something we'd rather not know, but something worth knowing nonetheless. The chickens, for their part, continue to be chickens. They lay eggs, they peck at things, they occasionally wander across invisible property lines in search of interesting vegetation. And Lord Bertrand? He's become quite a decent neighbour, actually. We share a fence now, built together as Father Marcel originally suggested. His chickens and mine mingle freely, apparently having signed their own peace treaty without consulting either of us. He never did grow any more turnips. But sometimes on quiet evenings when the wind is right, you can still hear someone in the distance humming that damned song about the chicken war of 1320. And despite everything, the drama, the embarrassment, the near-death experience over poultry, I find myself smiling when I hear it. After all, it's not everyone who gets to be remembered as the man who made a lord eat mud, even if that's not exactly what happened. The song is better than the truth anyway, and the chickens don't seem to mind being famous. Thank you for joining Henri on his journey through one of history's most magnificently ridiculous conflicts. We hope this tale of chickens, turnips, and wounded pride has helped ease you toward peaceful sleep, with perhaps a gentle smile at the eternal human capacity for turning molehills into mountains. The historical facts, because apparently someone needs to set the record straight. Now, for those of you who are still awake and wondering what actually happened versus what the tavern songs claim, allow me to present the factual chronology of events, stripped of all narrative embellishment and dramatic license. Because nothing says bedtime story quite like a dry recitation of historical facts, delivered with all the excitement of reading a tax ledger. The conflict began on a Tuesday morning in autumn 1320, when Henri's 7 chickens, Bernadette, Claude, and 5 others whose names have been lost to history, crossed the property line between Henri's modest farm and the adjacent manor belonging to Lord Bertrand de Montclair. The chickens, following their natural behavioural patterns, pecked at a single turnip growing in what Lord Bertrand considered his private garden. The damage was minimal, a few holes in one root vegetable that was already past its prime. Lord Bertrand's initial response was a formal visit to Henri's property, during which he demanded compensation for what he termed an act of agricultural aggression. Henri's response, laughter, was apparently not what Lord Bertrand had hoped for. The nobleman departed, promising that this was not over, which proved to be accurate. 3 days later, Lord Bertray escalated the matter by sending a formal written demand via pageboy. The document, composed in Latin and sealed with red wax, detailed 12 separate charges against Henry and his unlawful fowl, including trespassing, destruction of property, and, remarkably, emotional distress caused by flagrant disrespect. The demands included financial compensation equivalent to 6 months of Henry's income, public apology, fence construction, weekly egg tribute, and a written promise that the chickens would conduct themselves with appropriate deference. Henri's counteroffer of a monthly egg basket was rejected. Lord Bertrand's response was delivered via the same pageboy, who was instructed to formally challenge Henri by slapping him with a leather glove, a medieval custom that constituted an official challenge to combat. The pageboy, reportedly uncomfortable with his role in the escalating conflict, performed this duty with minimal enthusiasm. Father Marcel, the local priest, attempted mediation by visiting Lord Bertrand's manor with communion wine and suggestions for peaceful resolution. His proposals included shared fence construction, property blessing, and general Christian forgiveness. Lord Bertrand's response was to ban Father Marcel from his lands for supporting chicken terrorism and to formally declare Henri's chickens enemies of the realm. During this period, Lord Bertrand also created a shrine to the damaged turnip, complete with candles and a commemorative plaque reading, "Lest we forget." Henri accepted Lord Bertrand's formal challenge to trial by combat, which was scheduled for dawn 1 week later. Word of the duel spread throughout the region, attracting spectators from multiple villages. Local entrepreneurs established betting pools with 10-to-1 odds against Henri, food stalls, and entertainment. The event took on festival-like atmosphere, complete with hired musicians and organised seating. On the appointed morning, approximately 200 people gathered in the field behind the blacksmith's shop. Lord Bertrand appeared in partial armour and a banner reading "Defender of Turnips." Henri wielded a borrowed sword provided by village elder Thomas, which he named Cluck, in honour of the conflict's origins. The duel itself lasted approximately 15 minutes. Lord Bertrand's combat technique emphasised theatrical flourishes over practical sword work, while Henri employed evasive tactics and occasional counterattacks. The conflict concluded when Lord Bertrand, attempting a decisive blow, lost his balance due to armour weight and exhaustion, falling face first into the mud. No serious injuries occurred. Following his fall, Lord Bertrand experienced what witnesses described as a moment of clarity regarding the proportional response to poultry property damage. He formally yielded, acknowledging that the chickens really just wanted the turnip. Father Marcel declared the conflict resolved, and the crowd dispersed after helping Lord Bertrand to his feet. In the immediate aftermath, a local musician composed the Ballad of the Chicken War, which spread throughout the region within weeks. The song, featuring dramatic embellishments and creative interpretations of events, established Henri as a folk hero known by various titles, including the Chicken Knight, Defender of Poultry Rights, and the Man Who Made a Lord Eat Mud. Lord Bertrand, having gained perspective on his behaviour, made a formal apology to Henri 3 days after the duel. The two neighbours subsequently constructed a shared fence and established cordial relations. Lord Bertrand discontinued turnip cultivation and dismantled his turnip shrine. The chickens were granted permanent amnesty and continued their previous behavioural patterns without apparent awareness of their historical significance. Conflict generated lasting cultural impact through the aforementioned ballad, which remained popular in regional taverns for several years. Henri's reputation as a reasonable man who stood up to unreasonable authority made him a minor local celebrity, though he reportedly found this fame more embarrassing than gratifying. The chickens lived out their natural lifespans without further involvement in international incidents. Property disputes in the region decreased following the duel, possibly due to the cautionary example of escalated poultry conflicts. Lord Bertrand's subsequent behaviour toward neighbours improved markedly, suggesting that public humiliation over turnip combat had therapeutic value. Historical records indicate that trial by combat over minor property disputes was not uncommon in 14th century France, making this conflict unusual primarily for its specific circumstances rather than its resolution method. The detailed documentation of events exists primarily due to Henri's decision to record the proceedings for future generations who need to know how stupid this got. The shared fence between the properties remained intact for several decades, serving as a memorial to the conflict and a practical solution to poultry boundary issues. Neither neighbour pursued further legal action, suggesting mutual satisfaction with the duel's outcome. Modern historians classify the chicken war as an example of how personal pride and social hierarchies could transform minor disputes into major conflicts in medieval society. The incident is frequently cited in academic discussions of conflict escalation and the role of humour in diffusing tension, though some scholars debate whether Henri's sword was actually named Cluck, or if this detail was added by later balladeers for dramatic effect. And there you have it, the complete, unembellished historical record of how 7 chickens, 1 turnip and 2 grown men managed to create a folk legend that people still sing about today. Because apparently, even in 1320, people needed reminding that sometimes the most reasonable response to unreasonable behaviour is to meet it head-on, preferably with a sword named Cluck. Thank you for listening, one last time. May your sleep be deep, your dreams quiet, and your mind at peace. Good night.